Hey there, welcome back. This is our third tutorial about working with EQ. In this video, I'm going to review some EQ settings that are commonly used by audio engineers. By no means are these the EQ Bible. They'll just give you a starting point for adjusting EQ in your music. The golden rule of EQ: less is more. If your track sounds fine without the EQ, then leave it alone. The exception is when you're creating some unique sounds with extreme EQ effects. But if you want your instruments to sound natural, then less EQ is going to give you better results. The second rule, which we talked about before, is that cutting is better than boosting, especially if you're trying to fix a problem. For example, if a vocal sounds thin, try cutting a few of the highs slightly and then boosting the gain instead of boosting the lows. So why is that? Well, because the more clutter you remove from a mix, the better it is. Also, sometimes the way to get better sound is to cut some frequencies in a different track that seem to be interfering. The third rule that's common to most instruments is that usually high-frequency instruments need some high cuts and some low-level boosting, whereas low-frequency instruments usually need some low-level cut and some boosting on the highs. Now let's take a moment to go through some of the instruments you'll be recording more frequently. The bass usually needs a boost in the mid-range and sometimes in the high range. This is what lets it cut through and be heard on smaller speakers. The clarity of a bass is defined a lot around 800 Hz. If your bass sounds not well enough defined, you might need to roll off somewhere a little under 150 Hz and then boost in the mids. Now let's talk about drums. Same thing with the kick drum. Very subtly, you might need a boost in the mids or in the highs. Except in hip-hop and rap, your kick might need just a little low-level boost. You may want some tighter Q cuts at about 160 Hz, 800 Hz, and 1 to 3 kHz. These cuts will make space for the fundamental tones of the bass guitar to stand out. Boost a little between 5 and 7 kHz to improve the snap. Now let's talk about the snare drum. A snare sounds warmer with a boost in the lows and some cut of the highs. You can cut an annoying crack with a high cut. If you boost the lows a little, they'll sound a little fatter, but it really depends on the snare sound itself. The snare is an instrument that gets really clouded with too much low end. Most snares are out front enough so that a few cuts might be all that's needed. If the snare's too transparent in the mix but you like the levels, just cut a little around 5 kHz to give a bit of distance. You may need to boost slightly around 10 kHz to brighten up the sound. Most toms could use a cut between 300 and 800 Hz to make the sound less muddy. With a tom, you want color, not big low end. Your hi-hat usually doesn't need EQ if it's recorded clean. Usually, applying EQ to your hats is to cut out hiss with some reduction of the highs. The mids in the hats are important. The tracks that you lay down with the overhead mics really define the sound of the drums. They give the kit ambiance and space, but sometimes they need a cut in about the 400 Hz area and can use a roll-off under 100 Hz. Not for power, just for color. Roll off anything that'll mask harmonic content or make the sound dull. A little boost of a shelving filter around 12.5 kHz can bring in more air. Now let's talk about how to EQ your guitars. Guitars might need boosting in the mids and in the lows depending upon your desired sound and what else is present in the mix. A hefty guitar might need to be thinned out a little by cutting the lows and the mid-lows, especially if you mic'd up close. The fundamentals of the guitar are in the mid-range, so play around with the 400 to 800 Hz area and look at the band around 1 to 5 kHz for the shine. Above this, you'll be adding brightness, which might conflict with other instruments, so be judicious. Good string banks and piano sounds from your synthesizer usually don't need EQ. You may want to thin them out a bit if they only provide support, but if they are really meant to be present, you can thicken them in the mids a little bit. Of course, this is all highly subjective. Leave your reverb returns alone, generally, unless the reverb is annoying and noisy. Cutting some highs can soften it up a bit. Same with strings. For your horns, harsh horns can be softened by cutting some of the high mids. If your track sounds clean, just leave it alone though. Vocals. These usually need a boost in the mids or high mids, but it really depends on the voice. Vocals often get lost among guitars. Sometimes I need to boost mids in the vocals and then cut them a bit in the guitar or something like that. Vocals can also have annoying hiss or sibilance, and sometimes a high shelf will help with this. I tend not to use a de-esser on my voice. It takes out too many harmonics. While the lead vocal is usually the most important instrument in a song, it shouldn't be too loud. Conversely, your shy vocalist during mixing might insist on making it too quiet, so watch for that too. I personally cut a little around 200 Hz, add a couple decibels at 3 kHz, and again at 5 kHz if the recording is really clean. So let's close this video with some general guidelines for how to improve the quality of your recording using EQ. To add fullness, you can add a few decibels around 150 Hz. To get rid of muddiness, cut a few decibels between 200 to 250 Hz. To add clarity, boost a little at about 3 kHz. To add presence, add a little bit at 5 kHz. To add air or brighten, boost a little bit at 10 kHz. To get rid of sibilance, those are the S's and sh, cut a little between 7.5 and 10 kHz. To keep backup vocals from competing with lead vocals, cut the backup vocals a little in the low end, below 250 Hz, and at the 2.5 to 3.5 kHz range. To add clarity, boost a little around 10 kHz without letting it get in the way of the lead vocal. And this concludes our tutorial about common EQ settings. In our next lesson, we'll be taking a look at compression.